Hi, everybody. Welcome to Screen Less, Play More podcast. I am Cynthia, the founder of ScreenLessPlayMore.com, and I am so excited to talk to Natalie Wexler about how generative AI is rotting our brains, as well as why memorization shouldn't be a dirty word in education anymore, and what we gain or lose from doing things on screens instead of on paper. Natalie Wexler is an education writer focusing on literacy, cognitive science, and fairness. She's the author of Beyond the Science of Reading and The Knowledge Gap, the Hidden Cause of America's Broken Education System and How to Fix It. And she is the host of 2 seasons of the Knowledge Matters podcast. Welcome, Natalie.
Oh, thank you, Cynthia. I'm glad to be here.
Great. I found you through your fascinating Substack called Minding the Gap, where you recently wrote an article entitled How Generative AI Can Rot Your Brain. And I am so excited to hear more about it. It was a fabulous read. So in the article, you discuss a paper that's called The Memory Paradox, Why Our Brains Need Knowledge in an Age of AI. And you start by citing an older example that if you use GPS instead of a map, your brain isn't making a mental model of how the city is laid out. So how does this translate to things like using ChatGPT to write a paper for us or an email for us or to summarize a book?
Yeah, so there's this is a relatively new phenomenon. So there's some experimental studies emerging which show that, for example, there was a study of 1,000 high school students who used ChatGPT as a study assistant for a math test, and another group, the control group, studied in the old-fashioned way. Okay. And the kids who relied on ChatGPT actually did worse on the math test, even though they were confident that they knew the stuff. So the researchers hypothesized that those students were using it as a crutch rather than actually doing the cognitive work of understanding the math. So they had the illusion of knowledge, but not the actual thing. And there were other studies now, there was a meta-analysis of, I think, 14 studies basically pointing in the same direction. And there's one study with, and this is a very common use of generative AI, is to have the ChatGPT or whatever just do your writing for you, produce an essay for you. And so, and I focus a lot on writing. And one thing that I've realized in reading the research, talking to experts, is that writing itself it's not just the product of like what's in your head. It's the process of writing can be a very powerful learning experience. And if we rely on things like, tools like ChatGPT to do that kind of cognitive work for us, we not only learn less, but it's not exactly a muscle that atrophies, but we are not we're not developing our cognitive abilities, our abilities to really think about anything, really, to think critically and analytically, because that is what we do when we write. We have to really understand, if you've ever written something, a piece of expository writing, you actually need to understand what you're writing about in order to produce a good piece of writing.
Right.
And it's a process of writing that enables you to understand it and come to new insights.
Which in theory would be why we had to do things like book reports or write a paper in college, because you really have to understand it to synthesize it. And I guess, it's certainly different than just a quiz or a multiple choice or something. You're saying like it's really like there's something different than goes on in your brain when you're actually synthesizing it.
Right. I mean, there's a value to multiple choice quizzing as well, but it doesn't give you as many cognitive benefits. So there's something called retrieval practice, which is a concept in cognitive science that tells us the more we try to recall something we have stored in long-term memory, the better able we are to retrieve it when we need it. So factual information, and that is far more efficient than just looking things up. So quizzes, actually, this retrieval practice has sometimes been called the testing effect. The more you can quiz yourself, or you can take a multiple choice quiz or whatever, but that act of retrieving that information strengthens the pathways. So the next time you're reading something and you need that information, you're more likely to get it quickly. And writing can do that as well. But the additional thing, or one additional thing that writing provides, is what cognitive scientists refer to as elaboration or elaborative interrogation, which just means asking and answering questions like how and why and what's an example, that kind of thing, not just yes, no questions. And that kind of self-questioning has been found to, it's not just a good way of engaging in retrieval practice, but it also deepens understanding, comprehension. And so the other thing about writing that, and I'm talking really, I mean, I guess there's a value to assigning book reports and things, but what's even more important is to actually explicitly teach kids how to write, which we have not been doing a very good job of, because writing is very difficult. And if it's overwhelmingly difficult, you're not going to get these cognitive benefits. But the third kind of benefit that you can get from writing, if it's explicitly taught in a manageable way, is a familiarity with the complex syntax of written language, sentence structure. The sentence structure of written language is almost always more complex than the kind of sentence structure we use in conversation.
Right.
And that can be, so things like subordinating conjunctions and appositives, which are phrases describing a noun. If we don't use those kinds of constructions in conversation, so kids may not be familiar with them, and even if they can decipher the words and maybe have a good vocabulary, if they're not familiar with that kind of sentence structure, it's a real barrier to comprehension. But if you teach kids how to use that kind of sentence structure, then they're much better able to understand it when they encounter it in their reading.
Well, and so the education system, it seems, has gotten kind of obsessed in the past few generations with critical thinking above memorization. But you say in one of your articles that what enables critical thinking is knowledge. So does that mean, I would assume that's kind of a combination of experiencing things in the world that you know about them, but also actually memorizing facts and figures and just information.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the word memorization has become like a dirty word in education. And I think it's become associated with, it's always paired with the adjective rote, rote memorization. Now, rote memorization is memorizing stuff that you don't actually understand. And that's not very helpful. But memorization is, or retaining information, if you prefer, is really the basis of learning. The more information you have, let's say the more information you have about a subject in long-term memory, the easier it is to learn new things about that subject, because the new information has something to sort of, a framework to fit into, something to stick to. So yes, there's been this focus on, well, let's just teach critical thinking skills, sometimes like say 21st century skills like creativity and communication, or in the literacy area, for a long time, there's been a focus on comprehension skills like making inferences or finding the main idea of a text. And yes, all of these skills are important, but we have to understand they're not skills like riding a bike or playing tennis or decoding words where you just practice them and they get better. They are all highly dependent on knowledge. They're not abstract skills. Whether, for example, you can find the main idea of a text is going to depend to a large extent on how much knowledge you have relating to that text. It's going to be much easier to find the main idea of a text that's on a topic you're familiar with than if it's a text on a topic you know nothing about. And the same thing is true with something like critical thinking. And there have been experiments showing that, the more you know about a topic, the better able you are to think about it critically. Even with doctors, for example, there was one experiment that had cardiologists and I forget what other kind of doctor look at a clinical report about a patient who had cardiac problems, and then they were given some time to analyze this. Well, the cardiologists did much better than the other doctors because they knew a lot about the heart. So this is pretty well established and pretty universal. And so if we want kids to be good readers, comprehenders of their reading, if we want them to be good critical thinkers, we need to start with building their knowledge. It's not the end point, just factual knowledge, but it is the necessary condition for critical thinking. And I would say, I was talking about things like retrieval practice, and really the theory that underlies or explains all of these observed effects, like the more information you have about a topic, the better able you are to think critically about it, is something called critical load theory. Cognitive load theory.
Okay.
And that has to do with something called working memory, which is the aspect of our consciousness where we are taking in new information and trying to understand it, to learn, in other words. And the thing about working memory is it's very limited in its capacity. It could hold maybe 5 items of new information for about 20 seconds, and then it just gets overwhelmed.
Okay.
So the best way around those limitations on working memory is to have relevant information stored in long-term memory.
Okay.
And to be able to retrieve it. Because if you can just retrieve information from long-term memory, then you don't have to juggle that in working memory. And it opens up the capacity of working memory to take in new information.
Okay.
And to think critically and analytically, all of those things. So that's a sort of, cognitive science explanation for these effects.
I mean, I've heard that one should think more of memory like a muscle and less like a filing cabinet. But is it actually almost more like a path through a field or something, and like if you tramp it down enough times, it becomes this visible path the more you use it? I mean, is it kind of like that, or like a subway system? It's like there's connections and pathways that become sort of more strong the more you use those pathways?
Yes, I do think that the network idea is better, certainly better than the filing cabinet idea, but even it's what was the other idea that you said?
Oh, just like a pathway that you would like. But
it's not static. It is about pathways and forming knowledge networks. Every bit of information that we take in, it's not just stored, it's also connecting, it's expanding our networks of sometimes there are different terms for this. Schema is one term, but for example, schema is just like a framework into which to fit knowledge. Let's say you're a baby or a toddler and you're learning what a dog is. And you see like 10 different dogs. You see a Great Dane, you see a Chihuahua, but eventually all that factual information gets sort of absorbed into the mind and the brain. And you have now a framework in which to fit the concept of dog. If you see, a poodle, even though it doesn't look exactly like a Great Dane or a Chihuahua, naturally your mind just fits it into that dog category. And so all of these bits of factual information are contributing to these networks of knowledge that we can draw on and that enable higher order thinking, comparisons and analysis and all of those things.
So if you're a little kid and you've seen a bunch of dogs and then you read a story about a dog, you can pay a little bit more attention to the actual story instead of thinking, what is this thing that they're talking about that has 4 legs? And So you're saying that's like where the knowledge comes in. Is it like, it doesn't weigh down our experience of reading because we just think, oh, I know what a dog is. And then you move on to like the other information in the passage or the book.
Right. I mean, it's just automatic. We're not conscious of these things. But I would say the kind of, and there's a famous study called the baseball study, which showed that, I won't go into all of the details, but poor readers, like who scored low on a reading comprehension test, generally, if they were baseball experts, and these were like 7th and 8th graders, and you gave them a passage to read describing half an inning of a baseball game, there was no problem with their comprehension.
Okay.
But the kids who scored high on the standardized reading comprehension test, but they didn't know anything about baseball, they struggled to understand the description of half an inning of a baseball game. Because if you're reading about baseball, you already know what a double play is, for example. You don't have to think about that, and you don't have to go Google it. You don't have to ask ChatGPT either what it is or whatever it is that kids would do nowadays. You can pay attention to whatever is in that piece of text that you're reading. And I would just add that we're talking about dogs and baseball, but really, when it comes to reading, the most crucial kind of knowledge to have is more academic kinds of knowledge, or knowledge of general culture, like what part of the body does pneumonia occur?
Okay.
The more stuff like that, it has been found, the more likely you are to be able to understand anything you try to read, because that's the kind of knowledge that tends to be assumed by complex text. The writers assume that readers know certain things.
Okay.
You see this in any newspaper article or whatever. There are all sorts of references that are not explained because it's assumed the reader will understand them. And that's fine if you do understand them, but if you don't, it really interferes with your comprehension.
So if kids are learning just general things like, here's what the United States looks like, here's what all the states are, here's the human body, that's kind of general knowledge. What do you think is still really valuable in terms of memorization? Would it be like actual spelling, like spelling tests, multiplication tables? Like, what do you think is most beneficial in terms of actual memorization?
Well, I absolutely spelling and multiplication tables need to be memorized in order for kids to. This paper that I wrote about gave this kind of chilling example.
About the nurse.
Yeah, it was a hypothetical, but imagine two nurses, one of whom has memorized the multiplication tables as a kid, and the other has not. And there are people who say kids shouldn't memorize multiplication tables. We just need them to understand general math concepts. But if you're now a nurse and you are calculating a medication dosage and you put 5 times 10 into a calculator and it spits back 500, well, the nurse who's memorized the multiplication tables will immediately recognize that something is wrong there.
Mm-hmm.
But the nurse who has not won't even, automatically see that there's something wrong and may go ahead to overdose who knows how many patients.
Yeah.
So, but I do, it's not like that we have to have kids spend lots of time, just memorizing lists of facts. You can absorb a lot of information without actually just memorizing a list.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say there's some value, to memorizing the states and the state capitals. That's very old fashioned. Kids aren't asked to do that, but it could lay the basis for a sense of geography and a sense of what the United States is. But generally speaking, kids can absorb a lot of information just through, narratives.
Mm-hmm.
The human mind is actually hardwired to take in information better when it's presented through narratives. So history, for example, history is a series of stories, essentially. It has the word story in the word history.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there's this widespread belief that young children couldn't possibly understand history because it's too remote from their experience. But I've seen second graders, first graders absorb enormous amounts of information basically by listening to and talking about stories from history.
Mm-hmm.
And in the process, they're learning a lot of valuable factual information and a lot of valuable vocabulary, just general vocabulary as well.
Mm-hmm.
So when I talk about not so much memorization, but building kids' knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, for kids, it's not an unpleasant experience. They're actually very interested in the world, especially if you get them young. They want to know about the human digestive system. They want to know about ancient China or whatever. And it's both good for them and they really like it. And yet we haven't been doing it. And what ends up happening is kids get to higher grade levels without the foundational knowledge of the world that is assumed by the curriculum at higher grade levels. And so the information at the higher grade levels, they're not able to access it at the level that is expected, and it tends to go right by them.
Right.
So we have kids graduating from high school not knowing really basic things about the world, like where the United States is on a map of the world, or what Europe is, or
if you mention the name of a president from the 1920s, they're like, who? What are you talking?
Exactly. Not the 1920s. I write periodically about how little historical knowledge kids have, and this is not their fault. They can learn these things. We just haven't been teaching them. But there was somebody left a comment on one of my posts about how people don't know much about history. And this was a teacher in California who was a veteran teacher, and he'd been asked to observe a novice teacher who was teaching an ethnic studies course. And the assignment in the class that he observed was these were 11th graders, so it's high school.
Okay.
They were assigned to give presentations on whether the local elementary school should retain the name Thomas Jefferson.
Okay.
So the elementary school was named after Thomas Jefferson. And the guy who left, the teacher who left the comment said, the kids the presentations were okay, but they were kind of superficial and they all seemed to be saying the same thing. Like maybe were just repeating what the teacher had said.
Okay.
And then a few days later, he ran into one of the 11th graders who had been in that classroom who told the teacher the student did not know who Thomas Jefferson was.
Okay. So he was being asked to vote about something that he just had zero context for.
To give a presentation on whether this elementary school should be renamed or should retain the name Thomas Jefferson, you can't really address that question unless you know who Thomas Jefferson was.
Right.
But clearly, the teacher of that ethnic studies class assumed the kids knew who Thomas Jefferson was.
You have to know not only who he was, what he contributed, and why he's controversial.
Yes, right. I mean, I don't know enough to know what the teacher may have told them, if anything, about Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
But I actually came across something that I was reading the other day that said that students are more likely to know that Thomas Jefferson owned slaves than that he was president of the United States.
Right. Well, what's funny is anecdotally, I would say my children know who Thomas Jefferson is because we've watched Hamilton.
Yes.
So they know the songs about him and stuff. But but that, I guess, is just kind of an example of being exposed to different things that do give you knowledge. And I was going to say just another anecdote of my husband and I were actually both history majors. And so last year we were trying to decide where to go on vacation. We were contemplating going to Washington, D.C., but our kids are, they were 6 and 8. And we thought, oh, will they appreciate it? I don't know. And we finally said, you know what? Maybe this is how they will get into history. And they loved it. I mean, that was fun because it actually gave us the excuse to talk about different historical things because we were in the moment and seeing different monuments and going to different museums. And it was kind of astounding how much they did absorb and understand. And, we went to Gettysburg and we went, all these different places that now they really can talk to you about the Civil War and, all sorts of different things because they were immersed in it physically on our trip. But also I was going to say, as an aside, in terms of learning about World War II, there's a board game that my husband loves called Axis and Allies, and he's gotten the boys really into it. My boys are 7 and 9 now, and it's so funny to listen to them talking about World War II, and it's just information that they've learned from this board game. But they'll talk about Russia and Japan and all sorts of stuff just because they learned it in a game.
So this is something else that's important to note, which is, I mean, kids like yours and like mine I was also a history major, are really lucky. It's not just about history. It's about all sorts of knowledge of the world. Children of more highly educated parents who tend to have more resources are more likely to pick up this kind of academic knowledge at home effortlessly. It's not that parents are on a campaign to build their knowledge, but it just happens. The other kids, though, and they're in the majority, they depend on school for this kind of knowledge, right? And so, and our schools have not been doing a good job of building it. So what happens is, and this really explains a lot of the gap in test scores between the upper and lower students at the upper or lower ends of the socioeconomic spectrum. What happens is that the kids who are able to pick up knowledge outside of school do better on tests and in school because they're more likely to have the knowledge that's assumed by the curriculum. And the gap between the good readers, the good learners, and the poor readers or learners gets wider every year that kids stay in school. If the school is not building knowledge for all kids, because for one thing, it's been said that knowledge is like mental Velcro. It sticks best to other related knowledge, which is a very nice metaphor. So keeping that metaphor in mind, some kids like yours, like mine, are coming into school with more of that other half of the Velcro, more of that knowledge, that vocabulary. In our system, which also has students read at their supposed individual reading levels, so those kids, they're going to be in the higher reading groups, right? Because they're better readers. And they're also going to be able to retain new information, new vocabulary from what they're reading because it has Velcro to stick to, right? And that in turn enables them to read yet more complex text.
Okay.
But the other kids who come in with less of that other half of the Velcro, that academic knowledge and vocabulary, are first of all limited to simpler texts. But even if there's some new information or vocabulary in those texts, they're less likely to be able to retain it.
Okay.
Because they probably don't have the Velcro for it to stick to.
Okay.
And so every year that goes by, the gap between these two groups of readers gets wider and wider. So by the time they get to high school, it is very wide and almost impossible to really narrow at that point. And that phenomenon has been called the Matthew effect, which is a reference to the Gospel of Matthew, the part that says the rich get richer and the poor get poorer.
Okay. I think this is just so interesting. So it's not even really necessarily a issue as much about the fundamentals of reading, but more about their knowledge base prior to learning reading and sort of as they're learning reading through the years?
Well, I'd say it's both. It certainly can be both.
Okay.
Because when you say the fundamentals of reading, I assume you're talking about things like phonics.
Right, yeah.
Yes. So, and that's where, there's been a lot of buzz and publicity about how schools have not been doing a good job of teaching phonics. And that's true. And it's good that attention is being focused on that. But it's not enough to just, it's necessary but not sufficient. So you can have gotten good phonics instruction in kindergarten through second grade, but if you're not simultaneously acquiring knowledge and vocabulary, then when you get to higher grade levels and the texts start assuming more sophisticated knowledge and vocabulary, if you don't have it, you hit a wall. And unfortunately, what I'm hearing is that some places the message has come through as, we just need to spend more time on phonics, do more phonics, and then all our reading problems will be solved. And so they may be spending 2 hours a day on phonics, which no reading expert would recommend. I mean, the recommendation is more like 20 minutes or to 30 minutes.
Okay.
And there's a 2-hour reading block. What we should be doing with the rest of that reading block is through read alouds discussion and having kids do some reading related to the topics and the read alouds and discussion. And ideally, all of this is arranged in a coherent, logical order. We should be simultaneously building kids' knowledge of the world and their vocabulary while we are teaching them phonics, because you do not need to spend 2 hours a day on phonics.
Well, this is so interesting. You say in your article, even more fundamentally, I'd say the process of transforming information into knowledge is what makes us smart. Subcontracting out that process to a bot is likely to lead to a decline in cognitive function, not an enhancement of it. AI has its uses, but it's not a substitute for ensuring that kids acquire knowledge. So we're basically making ourselves less smart if we're using technology to do our thinking for us, right? Like we're not creating those pathways, right?
Right. And I mean, I'd say, there are, as I said in the piece, there are definitely beneficial uses of generative AI, especially for teachers, for helping them create materials. Maybe you do have to be careful. There has to be a human being monitoring this, because AI can, first of all, make mistakes. But when you're talking about adults who've already acquired a lot of knowledge of the world, using AI as a shortcut is not going to be that threatening, although we don't want to rely on it too much. But with kids who are still need to acquire a lot of knowledge of the world, just having them put a prompt into ChatGPT and then get an essay in 30 seconds. Some people have been saying, well, that's a great way to use AI. Kids can get an outline or get an entire essay and then tweak it, modify it, edit it, make it their own. But it's actually the hard work of coming up with an outline, of figuring out how these facts, connect to each other, of coming up with a thesis statement yourself. That it's not, again, it's not exactly a muscle, but it creates those pathways that are going to enable you to think in analytical ways generally. And I don't know if you've been following what's been coming out of college campuses.
Yes.
But I mean, there's a lot of rampant use of ChatGPT on college campuses, but I do think that, so what college professors are saying, for anyone who hasn't been following this, is, and I've talked to a number of them, for the past 5 years or maybe a little more, they've noticed that college students are just not able to do the amount of reading or the amount of thinking, of analytical thinking, that previous cohorts were able to do.
We have this quote in here from a professor that I thought was so great. He said, actually he or she said, generative AI is incredibly destructive to the teaching of university students. What students are doing, he wrote, is like going to the gym and asking a robot to lift weights for you.
Yeah.
And
right.
so,
I mean, and this is very distressing for a lot of college level instructors. I mean, because I think it's partly students have not been, even at good schools, they have not been explicitly taught how to write. So writing is very difficult. They've seen it as a product, this is just something to show, to be evaluated. It's not they're not aware of the benefits of the process. So of course they're going to take this shortcut, even if they know it's not really what they should be doing, of using ChatGPT. And then professors are confronted with essays that they are pretty sure have been generated by ChatGPT. But it's a real hassle to prove that. And, they are resentful, understandably, of spending their time giving feedback on an essay that wasn't even written by the student.
Yeah.
Some of them are now using generative AI to give feedback on those essays.
Oh, man.
So we're heading towards a really, like dystopian future if that keeps happening.
Well, so like you're saying, I mean, I've read so many articles that college students are just unable to even not only read really like archaic, old-fashioned novels, like what we would usually call the classics, that they're getting confused by things like Dickens and Faulkner because the language is so different from our common language, but just read a novel in general, cover to cover. And are you finding in research it's more because kids are constantly on their phones, they have less attention span these days, or is it going back to the fact that high schools and elementary schools are not assigning full novels, they're giving excerpts?
Well, I'd say it's both.
Okay.
I mean, it's undeniable that, I think even older adults like myself, you get used to scrolling, and it's a different kind of reading, and it's harder to sink your teeth into a 19th century novel that's 800 pages long. But I think that the message there is that schools actually need to work even harder to show kids the benefits and the value of reading at length, not just surrender to, this like a internet mind. And instead, schools have really been doing the opposite. It's sort of a separate phenomenon. It's kind of like a perfect storm because it's not connected in its origin, but it leads to the same bad place. There's been a widespread feeling that because there's been such a focus on these reading comprehension skills, like making inferences or finding the main idea, and it's partly testing pressure because it looks like the standardized tests are testing those skills, not any particular knowledge of any particular books or content, right? So, and schools felt under pressure to cover a lot of material. And well, why not use these excerpts, like, a few paragraphs rather than a whole book or whole chapter? Because that's what they're going to see on the tests. They're going to see an excerpt and then get comprehension questions. So this will put them for the tests. And really, the thinking is what we're teaching is these texts are really vehicles for teaching the skills. We're not reading these texts for themselves to appreciate them as works of literature. I'm making a broad generalization here. Not every teacher has that outlook, but some do. And there's pressure on teachers, even if they have their doubts about whether this is the best way to go. They are feeling pressure from administrators and the way curricula are structured, to just assign these excerpts. So in one of these articles about what's going on college campuses, there was one in the Atlantic, and this was a professor who had been teaching for a long time a great books course, reading the classics, the canon at Columbia. So a pretty elite school here. And he had noticed in recent years he just could not expect kids to do the kind of reading. They just weren't able to read at the length and the level of challenge that they used to. And one of his students came to him and said, well, it's really hard because I never had to read a whole book in high school.
That blows my mind.
And I mean, I actually talked to a couple of brothers actually who were a few years apart, but they went to a public school here in DC that is highly selective, really hard to get into. This, it's an elite public school. And they both told me they basically never had to read a novel throughout even at this fairly elite school. One of them had to just read Things Fall Apart in 9th grade. But after that, they were no Great Gatsby, no Scarlet Letter, no Pride and Prejudice, whatever. Just, to excerpts, chapters, essays, speeches, and I think some of this is blamed on the Common Core because the Common Core standards did put more emphasis on having kids read nonfiction, but it was interpreted to mean they have to read more nonfiction in English class, and what it was talking about really was across the curriculum that they should be reading more nonfiction. So that is also this misinterpretation has contributed to, well, we can't spend time on novels. Oh, and the other thing that has contributed to just reading these short texts and excerpts is that you can't rely on kids to do homework anymore. Even in some pretty, affluent schools, this is partly, I think this has been true for a long time in schools serving high poverty populations, because I volunteered in a high school like 15 years ago and the kids just didn't do homework. But during the pandemic, there was a sort of lowering of standards because kids were going through so much, and we'll make it impossible to flunk a course. And, if you don't do the homework, that's okay. And then once you lower those standards or lower those rigorous expectations, it's very hard to ratchet them back up. So kids are getting to college. They have not really had to do much reading outside of class. And if you want to do a novel and you can't rely on kids to read for homework, you've got to do all the reading in class.
Right. Yeah. It takes so much time.
Yeah.
Well, it seems like a silly, but I think is an important question. What is the benefit of reading an entire book, an entire novel?
Well, yeah. There's some writing on this. I think, for one thing, it can show kids that it's actually fun to read. Novels that take you into another world, that go, you're following the same characters across many chapters. They're more engaging.
Yeah.
And so, reading for fun is correlated with all sorts of good academic outcomes. So it's both, a source of pleasure that kids should be introduced to, and it's also, again, it's good for them. And I think we really should be introducing them to this idea when they're young that reading can be fun. And kids can really get into reading novels, chapter books when they're young. There's some research showing that reading fiction, especially novels, helps develop empathy. You can connect to a character in a completely different time and place.
Yeah, it puts you in somebody else's shoes.
Exactly. In a way that nonfiction generally doesn't enable you to do, to get into somebody's head like that. That is associated with the development of empathy and the ability to see things from another person's perspective, which, of course, in the current climate, we really could use more of that, right? So there are those things that distinguish novels from, say, short stories. And then sometimes people say, well, what about movies? That can be that kind of experience. And yeah, I'm not knocking new movies or plays if anybody goes to see plays anymore. But I think there is also, in addition to that, entering another person's world, a novel does require more cognitive effort. You aren't immersed visually in a scene. You are reading about it and you have to create that scene in your
Right.
head, which, I mean, that maybe this is, why we have to sort of encourage novel reading more than we need to encourage movie watching, because people don't necessarily want to expend more effort. But that effort, I think, is worthwhile because it does develop these cognitive abilities, imagination.
Absolutely. Because I had read an article a few months ago about some kids that truly could not have that movie in their heads. Like when they read a book, they weren't actually picturing it in their heads because they had so little experience doing that. And everything else in their life was doing it for them, whether it was what they were watching on their phone or watching a movie or watching a TV show. And that was given to them, the visual. They didn't have to conjure it up in their own head as they were reading. And if nothing else, I just think that's sad. Whether it's, whether it benefits them or not throughout life. But I just think that'd be kind of sad to go through life not being able to like visualize things in your head.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it actually kind of reminds me of, what I started that post with was the difference between reading a map and just having GPS guide you. When you're reading a map, you have to put these things together for yourself. And when you're reading a novel, you kind of have to put those things together for yourself too, rather than just being shown it visually.
Well, my son's first grade class, whenever they read a book, they have to do a little comprehension quiz on it on the computer. And although my 7-year-old son absolutely loves reading and does lots of reading at our house, when he's at school, he has figured out how to game the system, and he will look at the questions first and then hunt and peck through the book to find the answers to supposedly finish quicker and get his points and get done. Because if you do X amount of comprehension quizzes, you get to go to like Friday fun party or whatever. And you can't go to the Friday party if you don't have all of your AR tests finished. So I'm wondering if this gamification is also kind of quashing kids wanting to read just for fun.
I think so. I mean, I think it's turning reading into a chore, into a means to an end, rather than an experience that could be enjoyed for itself.
Right.
And it's not necessary to turn kids into good readers. I mean, these tests were never meant to be guides to instruction, and that is what they've become. There's a value to them, but it's not, they're not models for how to teach kids anything.
Well, I had decided to try to make reading fun for my kids by just finding whatever books were on topics that they seemed to be interested in. So if they were liking trains or Legos or whatever, or even like there might be a show that we were watching and that show would have a book associated with it. Like right now they're really into reading graphic novels that have to do with Star Wars or stuff like that, because I actually found a strange experience as a kid. I so wanted to do whatever my dad did, and he was a voracious reader, that I would try to read whatever he was reading. So in like 4th grade or something, I was like, oh, I'll read The Sun Also Rises. And it was way over my head. And so I actually got this thought of like, reading is boring. This is awful. Why would anyone want to do it? And I should have been reading The Babysitter's Club or Nancy Drew or something. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do this differently with my kids. And I just started giving them like really fun books that people might think like, oh, come on, you're like letting them read about Legos. But I have found that really engaged them, and because it was things that they were reading about that they liked, and now they really love to read. And I'm wondering, like, what are some of the other tips you would give parents to try to get kids to want to read and have it be pleasurable?
Yeah, I think for parents, it really does make sense to follow kids' interests. I would say with a caveat here is that schools have been saying that's the way to go. Just give them, choice. They have to read something at their reading level, but let them choose whatever it is they want to read. But in a school context, I mean, there are going to be kids who could get very interested in topics they don't know anything about yet. So the school's job, I think, is primarily to introduce them to new topics in an engaging way. And often from what I've heard, then kids do want to read more about them. But for parents, I would say the kind of thing that you've done, which is to sort of reinforce what they're interested in by giving them books on those things. And also, just as important is actually back and forth dialogue about, what they're interested in, whether it's related to a book or not. But that is really crucial for developing language abilities. I mean, oral language is the sort of foundation for, then understanding written text and producing writing. So, there's been a lot of emphasis on having parents read aloud to young children, and that's great. But in addition to reading aloud, then talking about what's in the book and using the vocabulary that maybe there's some new vocabulary that's been introduced. If you engage in a dialogue that uses that vocabulary, the kids are much more likely to retain that information in long-term memory, and then it'll be there in the future if they come across, like, say you're reading, a kid is interested in rocks, so you get a book from the library about different kinds of rock, and the kid learns the word sedimentary. And then maybe sometime later that word comes up in something that the child is listening to or reading, and that word will now be familiar. So the dialogue is also really important to reinforce that new knowledge.
Good point. And I just kind of figured myself, I thought, well, as long as I get them interested in reading in general and kind of get them hooked, that then once that's their habit, then yes, maybe someday I can be like, here's Brave New World. But they're not going to want to do that right away. You kind of like slowly get them interested.
And I do also think that reading chapter books, like every night another chapter or something, and reading aloud can be really, a bonding experience, but also introducing them to that idea of a story that continues across chapters and how the characters develop and all of that. And, if they're not getting that from school, then parents can fill that gap. And I think it's an important one to fill.
I'm just curious, what is your favorite book?
Oh gosh, I don't know that I have a favorite book. I've always been an avid reader. I was an only child, we lived in a neighborhood where there weren't a lot of other kids around. So, books for my friends and my siblings. And
so you've probably got a list of like 20 favorites.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that when I was a young kid, but I remember like middle school, high school years, I loved reading Dickens, which might sound really weird, but I can remember, like, I would take this city bus to school, and I remember sitting on the bus laughing out loud because, Dickens is actually pretty funny.
Okay, that's funny.
Get into it. I'm sort of sad that I doubt very many kids read Dickens anymore.
Yeah. Well, one thing I was really curious to ask you about is that my son's first grade class last year, the teacher would not actually, or very seldomly, read them a book for story time. She would turn on the Promethean screen and have YouTube read them a book. And is there any sort of research about how that is different and how that experience is different for kids in terms of how they're learning reading or how they're experiencing reading and words and books if it's on a screen instead of a human reading to them?
I a while ago, I'm not an expert on that area, but I do remember reading something about studies showing that most kids don't absorb as much from a screen, from listening, and just from it, that it is more powerful to have a human being reading, and not just reading, but you want to like pause every once in a while and say, so what just happened? Or what do you think about that? And, have that back and forth and to ensure engagement as well. You don't want to do it like after every sentence, but and to have the whole class engaged. Often, these days, kids are all reading different things because there's this leveled reading. I mean, there might be a read aloud for 10 or 15 minutes. I don't know about it in your kid's school, and then everybody goes off to just read whatever they're reading. And that read aloud for 10 or 15 minutes is really just to model whatever skill they're supposed to be practicing. So there's no common content, really. And there's no basis for common class dialogue. And that, it doesn't really lead to a good sense of classroom community. Kids aren't interacting, and it's really beneficial, I think, especially probably for the kids who are in the lower reading groups, but for all kids to be talking about the same content and being able to offer their own comments and appreciate each other's insights and all of that. And I've seen that in classrooms that are, doing things differently, that are using knowledge building curricula where there's a common read aloud that's being read for its content. And then, kids have lots of interesting things to say, and they're talking to each other. But if you've got 25 kids reading 25 different books and the teacher may not even know what books they're actually reading, then you don't have that experience.
Well, and I suppose it also just introduces children to the concept of you can have a discussion about a book, and that's something you could ask somebody at a party or ask somebody on a bus. Yeah. They need to learn that not everybody wants to talk about Minecraft all the time. There's other things you can discuss, and books are one of those things that you could have in common with somebody and have a discussion about.
Yeah.
I'm wondering also, what is the research about reading on screens versus reading on paper?
Yeah, there is some research on that. And basically what it says is that when people read on screens, especially if it's nonfiction or maybe fairly dense, they think they're understanding more, but they're actually understanding less. That we tend to go faster when we're reading on a screen. And we get the illusion of knowledge, but that our understanding and retention of the information is generally less than when we're reading from a hard copy, from a print version. So, and I know more and more schools are shifting to materials that are just digital, and I would be cautious about that. I think it's really you're missing something. I mean, what I do, I do read a lot on screens, and it's a lot of it is pretty dense. But so there are ways to compensate for this. And what I do is I take notes on what I'm reading, and that helps me really process it and make sure I am understanding and retaining it.
And are you using actually a pen and your hand and a paper?
No, I mean, that would be better. That would be even more. I mean, there's also evidence showing that when you take notes by hand rather than typing it on a device, that you are more likely to understand and retain the information, because you can't just transcribe. You actually have to distill, wait, what's important here? But I confess that I do tend to just type rather than writing by hand would take me too long. But the other thing you can do, I mean, and there's also evidence for this, is if you have taken notes on a digital device, then reading them over is very helpful. And then, but what I tend to do, I mean, I'm usually taking notes because I'm going to write something. So then I put it all together. I create my own, sometimes I create an outline myself, but then writing about it really ensures that you understand and retain that information.
Yeah.
So there are ways to combat the screen reading phenomenon, but I'm not sure that many schools are doing that.
Yeah. And the AR tests, like I was talking about, that my son does, they read the book on a screen, and they also have the option to have the computer read it to them. I appreciate that for kids that are having difficulties or have dyslexia or something, but I think, I'm just thinking that gives them so much less opportunity to practice reading if they're constantly asking the computer to read it to them. So, I mean,
I think, as you said, it could be good for kids who need more support, but for other kids, it can be, a crutch.
Yeah,
so they can avoid actually reading.
Like when you were just talking about writing notes and going over your notes, that reminds me of something I forgot to ask you, was that you've written that one of the ways that kids can really retain things better and learn knowledge in general is to, throughout the school year, keep going back to the same thing and maybe have periodic quizzes on things, because does that just kind of re-emphasize those pathways in their head? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, it's a form of retrieval practice. It's if in order to ensure that the information really is both retained and accessible, the more you practice retrieving it, the better off you're going to be. And so ideally, though, you don't have to just retrieve. I mean, there's a value to retrieval practice, but there are curricula that are called spiraling curricula where, and really all curricula ideally should do some of this, where the same concepts are brought back, but maybe the following year, but at a deeper level. So you might learn about this one curriculum that I'm most familiar with. Kids learn about ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt in first grade, and then they learn about ancient India, ancient China, and ancient Greece in second grade. And the same concepts run throughout, that civilizations, that you need a water source, you need this, you need that, and that you need fertile land to grow crops. So it's not just boring, like, okay, what is the definition of crops? It's coming back in the context of a new story, but it's the same concepts, and that reinforcement really helps them then engage in analytical thinking. So, for example, I was one day observing a second grade class, and they were now studying ancient Greece after having studied 4 other ancient civilizations previously. And the teacher asked the class, so what was something unique about ancient Greek civilization? These are second graders, and these kids, most of them came from non-English speaking families, but a bunch of hands went up, and she called on one little boy, and he said, something unique about ancient Greek civilization was that they weren't near rivers and they didn't have fertile land, so it was difficult for them to grow crops. But he couldn't have answered that question in that way unless he had acquired a lot of knowledge that was, building on itself about ancient civilizations. That enabled him to engage in that analysis, that comparing and contrasting.
He understood how the other civilizations had worked, so he knew the difference when somebody was an outlier.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, he could see, he had that base of knowledge on which to say, hey, there's something different about ancient Greece. So it's not just bringing back this. It can be, but it's not just a mechanical process of bringing back vocabulary. Okay, remember this vocabulary. It can be in a different context where it takes on a somewhat different meaning, but it also triggers the memory of what this meant, in ancient Egypt.
So just constantly building on the previous year, the previous lesson.
Yes. And I mean, there are now a number of knowledge building elementary literacy curricula out there that are organized around topics and are constructed coherently in this way. If people are interested in what they are, I would recommend going to the website of the Knowledge Matters campaign. So it's knowledgematterscampaign.org, I believe. And their curriculum experts have identified, I think it's now 10 different curricula, beginning in kindergarten. Some of them go through 8th grade, that do build knowledge and often use whole texts and books and don't put these skills in the foreground. They put the content in the foreground and the knowledge building process in the foreground, and bring in skills like finding the main idea or comparing and contrasting, whatever, but as appropriate to whatever the content is.
Well, I found it interesting on your Substack, Mind the Gap. There was one of the articles that either you wrote or you had pointed to that was talking about ed tech in the classroom and how it just really has not panned out in terms of actually teaching kids, but that perhaps one of the main benefits of it could be to help kids recall important facts and just using it as a way to go back to previous material and continually recall it to kind of strengthen those memories, I guess, right?
Yeah, in theory, and you can make it a game, you can make it fun. But unfortunately, there are very few programs out there that focus on factual recall of information because schools are, if they're teaching anything substantive, they're all teaching different things. So when you see it, the software is either math or literacy, and that can work for decoding and phonics. But if we're talking about comprehension skills, then it's just this, and I've seen these in many classrooms. It's just this practice of, what is the main idea of this text, or what is this? Can you infer what this word means in this paragraph? And without really focusing on any particular content. And that does not work any better than if a human being does that in a classroom. These skills are not abstract skills. They can't be applied generally. They don't transfer from one content area to another. So the problem is it's probably there's no market because everybody's teaching different content. Companies don't have an incentive to create software that focuses on any particular body of knowledge. So it's really not out there.
Interesting. Well, another thing you had written about that I thought was very interesting and kind of sad is that during most of the 20th century, IQ scores steadily increased. But beginning with people born around 1975, scores plateaued and then declined, particularly in wealthier nations. And it seems like it may be due to less memorization and using more devices like calculators and phones that let students avoid the cognitive effort required for learning. But I was reading that and I thought, well, is a lot of this because we all read less as a society? Would this like cognitive effort and information in general be aided just if we would all go back to reading more?
Yeah, I mean, who knows? It's not really clear. This is a sort of, an international effect. So it's very general. It's not a controlled experiment. It's kind of speculative. But yeah, it does seem that it has something to do with people reading less or doing a different kind of reading, not doing deep reading, maybe just reading on screens and scrolling. And with it maybe started with calculators. We were using that to offload cognitive effort. And that this paper that I wrote about kind of traces it back to calculators and the internet. And now we've got generative artificial intelligence that's really taking, offloading our cognitive effort. And who knows what will happen in the future.
Oh boy. Stay tuned. The last question that I love to ask everybody about is, we're talking about doing screens less, playing more. And one of the important things for kids growing up is getting more independence and more responsibility. And I'm just wondering if you're willing to share a time when you were a kid or a teen that you remember doing something without your parents and without adults. It was just all you, and what that was.
Well, I have many such memories because my parents gave me a lot of freedom. Neither of them could drive, so we didn't have a car. If I wanted to get somewhere, I had to use public transportation. So when, from the age of 8, we moved from New York City to Baltimore, and I was going to a school that was at the edge of town. We lived downtown, and I was going to a school that was a good distance away. And every morning and afternoon from the age of 8, I took a city bus by myself.
Wow.
Like a 45-minute trip each way, which is probably, people would call the child neglect authorities on parents to do that today. But, it wasn't that unusual then. I think it was somewhat unusual, but there was an older girl who was sometimes on the bus with me. She was like a year older. So,
okay.
Yeah, the scary part was that I'd have to I'd get off the bus stop, and it was like a block with no traffic to get to my school. But I had to go over this like little wooden bridge over some abandoned railroad tracks, which was no big deal, except that there was a rumor that there was a man under the bridge who was an exhibitionist.
Oh, no. So would you just run across the bridge?
I would tear across that bridge.
I mean, do you actually remember thinking to yourself like, hey, I'm really adult. I'm taking the bus by myself? Or like, do you remember being scared about it? Or
I just accepted it. I was 8. I do remember that I had a new best friend, and I wanted her to come spend the night, and her mother wouldn't let her ride the bus with me because it was too dangerous, I guess. I don't know. So at that point, I thought, what a wimp,
Yeah. Funny. Well, thank you so much. I feel like I could talk to you for 5 hours. This stuff is so intriguing to me. And I just really appreciate your taking the time.
Well, thanks for having me. It was fun, and I'm glad, and I hope I'm reaching some, a new audience, because most of the people who I've been reaching are educators, but parents are a really important constituent.
Yeah. And as far as I know, most of my listeners are parents. And so how can they find out more? I mean, you've got your Substack. It's called Minding the Gap.
Right. And it's free.
And how else can they learn more about you or find your research? Or
I'd say the best thing to do is to go to my website, nataliewexler.com, and there's a bunch of information there about all sorts of things.
Okay. And then again, what is your podcast called?
Oh, so it's the Knowledge Matters podcast, and it's produced by the Knowledge Matters campaign, which I mentioned earlier. They have that website, which has a lot of great resources about knowledge building curricula. So I was the host of season 1, which came out a couple of years ago, which is called Reading Comprehension Revisited. And then season 2 was on somebody else, but we've just released the first episode yesterday of season 3. And I am a co-host of that. So I do 6 episodes, and all of these are 6 episodes, about half an hour each. My 2 episodes are the last 2, but my co-hosts are Dylan William, who is an eminent cognitive scientist who writes about education, and Doug Lemov, who has also written a lot about education, and they both have lots of great things to say. So I do recommend this season 3 podcast as well. It's called Literacy and the Science of Learning, I believe. And you can find those, any podcast platform if you search for the Knowledge Matters podcast. But you can also find it on the website of the Knowledge Matters campaign.
Okay, super. Well, thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you for listening to Screen Less, Play More podcast. If you like what you hear, please tell your friends, and please rate and review us on YouTube or Spotify or Apple, wherever you listen. That really helps other people find us and helps us get the word out. A special thanks to WJD, who does all of our IT, and Neil Penninger, who composed our theme music. Please also check out screenlessplaymore.com for research about kids and tech, some ideas on getting kids outside playing and away from screens, book recommendations, and so much more.